all of you today for the book release and discussion of My Enemy's Enemy, India and Afghanistan from the Soviet invasion to the US withdrawal. I have a personal interest in the subject because Afghanistan is a country I have lived and worked in, and I keep going there. We have a very eminent panel here, and this book has arisen out of Avinash's PhD in London, working with Harsh Pant. Again, Harsh is one of our very good strategic thinkers, and that shows up in the book. So what I do at this stage is not talk about the book at all, just to lay down one ground rule that please switch off your mobiles. Initially, Avinash will speak. Avinash teaches at the King's College? SOAS, sorry, of course we discussed it. At SOAS, this book says King's College. That is why. I knew we discussed SOAS, and since the book said King's College, I said that. He teaches there. He's done his PhD there, as I said. He'll speak for about 5-7 minutes on the book to tell us about the book. Then I'll request each of our panelists. Our panelists are, of course, Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who was the Indian ambassador to Afghanistan from 2005 onwards till 2008. He's dealt with Pakistan before. He's worked in Pakistan in our mission. He's dealt with Pakistan. He's dealt with disarmament. He was a permanent representative in Geneva. And before that also checked in the ministry dealing with disarmament. Subsequently, he was our ambassador to Nepal and to France. Now a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. Dr. Vishal Chandra is from the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. So I won't go as much as Avinash does to see the link between IDSA and MOD. It's actually a very tenuous dotted line link, but yes. Vishal has been working on Afghanistan for a number of years. He also has a very detailed book on Afghan politics, extremely detailed book on Afghan politics. So then our two panelists will give their comments. I'll wrap up. And I'm glad to see friends from the Embassy of Afghanistan to Balkhi. And we'll get a chance to all of us to interact. So Avinash, may I request you now to... KP, welcome, please sit.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha. First of all, I would like to thank Team Murti and HarperCollins for organizing this event, and to the panelists. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. I would like to thank Team Murti, Bhavan, and HarperCollins for organizing this event. It's an honor to be here, and also to be in the presence of such distinguished panelists, Ambassador Sood, Dr. Chandra, Mr. Sinha. I'm really, really honored. I have a very kind of limited time to pitch the book, and I'll really stick to that. I will not go into the detail, and as you'll realize, hopefully, when you read it, that there's quite a lot of detail in the book. What I'll tell you is the core question that the book asks, and the core argument that I offer. And the question, and whenever in India or in the region generally we think about Afghanistan, the dominating kind of entity is how do we deal with Pakistan? So the question that concerns this book is containing Pakistan the key driver of India's Afghanistan policy? Now there are many other drivers that could be, but this is something where the fulcrum of the debate really lies as to how to deal with Afghanistan given our relationship with Pakistan and given Pakistan's relationship with Afghanistan. And the answer to this question based on this research, which really transcends a lot of primary sources, interviews from different countries, different sources, is no. Pakistan is a very important driver of India's Afghanistan policy, but containing Pakistan is not necessarily the core objective of India's role in Afghanistan. There's much more nuance to motivations, to what kind of presence India has, and generally there is a consensus in India. Now, to anyone following this would seem really banal that Indians generally saying that we want a territorially secure, sovereign, stable Afghanistan, but that truly is the strategic vision. The debate, as it is, policy debate, come in as to how do you reach this goal of a united, stable, sovereign Afghanistan, given the complexity of the region as well as the situation on the ground. And this is where I really try to unpack the spectrum of this debate. There are some, policymakers who would say, okay, whoever our allies in Afghanistan should be those people and those groupings which are outrightly anti-Pakistan in their predilections, are not dependent on Pakistan. There's a broad category, and there are much nuance in this, and I've termed them partisans. And there is another end of the spectrum of this debate. They say that, yes, Pakistan is a problem entity as we see it. However, it's a neighbor of Afghanistan, and just having relationship with all those entities, all those political leaders who are anti-Pakistan in Afghanistan might not be sustainable in the long term. There will naturally be dependencies in certain pockets and parts of Afghanistan in Afghanistan on Pakistan. So we should really open up to anyone and everyone, regardless of the militancy of their Islam and their relationship with Pakistan security agencies. These are the kind of advocates I call conciliators. So really there's a debate between partisans and conciliators, and I must underline that this is not a binary. This is not either or. There's a lot of spectrum depending on the case in point. They're both, these ideas are getting refracted through the institutional apparatus of policy making in India. What the book then does is see which of the two larger, these analytical categories as I articulate them, influences policy output between 79 and 2015. So in 92, India was open to the Mujahideen government. In 96, India was very against the Taliban's rise. In 2001, India took a certain decision. When the idea of reconciliation started coming in post-2009, India started to recalibrate its approach towards the Taliban. So really it's a detailed inquiry into how these two different advocacies influence. And the three drivers that actually determines which of the two will influence. First, and the most important driver, is India's desire to strike a strategic balance between Afghanistan and Pakistan. I think this often gets lost in this larger kind of narrative of proxy warfare. It's actually quite a misplaced, if not incorrect, always incorrect narrative. The idea is really to have a strategic balance between Afghanistan and Pakistan. We don't want Pakistan to have an unduly strong influence in Afghanistan, but vice versa as well. And there have been, historically, there have been points in which Afghanistan was trying to interfere in different ways, and I'm talking pre-79, in Afghanistan's domestic polity. The second, both. Pakistan was as well, and Pakistan, both of them. I mean, there was a healthy interaction between both the countries on that count. And yes, Pakistan's role has been fairly well documented. The second driver is the international political environment on Afghanistan. How did the Soviet Union behave in Afghanistan? How did the Americans behave in Afghanistan? Whether India is on the same keel with Iran or Russia? All these regional power play, all these questions become important in determining which side the policy fulcrum lay within India. And the final driver, the third driver, apart from those two, is the domestic situation in Afghanistan itself. Now, apart from the goodwill quotient that India enjoys in Afghanistan, which is very, very deep, I mean, there's a lot of love for Indians, different political groups, different political leaders in Afghanistan coming from different hues value India differently. And one example was, when President Ashraf Ghani came to power, he reached out to Pakistan. And I think that created some degree of anxiety in India, even though we put a very brave face to that, what if this works out? And expectedly did not. But the fact is that there are different leaders who would value India differently. So it's not that what allies we want, it's also how Afghans react themselves to the situation. So these three key drivers of India's Afghanistan policy determines whether it's the partisans or the conciliators which determine policy output. And this book, it's 288 pages of, maybe more, of detailed exposition of who dominated policy output at different points in time. And I think the American Secretary of State is coming tomorrow, so this discussion, this debate continues to go on. It's not a one-off, it's an ongoing debate, and this framework can perhaps be applied to neighboring countries beyond Afghanistan as well. I'll stop right there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Avinash, for really bringing out the framework in the book and some of the detailing such a short while. So before I request Ambassador Sood to speak, let's do the honors of releasing the book. And the book, I believe, should be available on sale outside, right? So, I hope you'll do the honors with that. May I now request Mr. Sood.
Thank you, Shakti. And congratulations to Avinash on having produced what is a very rich record. And I don't think really we have documented this period from an Indian perspective, the period of the Soviets coming in 1979 till the Americans announcing their withdrawal from combat operations, which was end of 2014, a very critical period actually. But I don't think anybody has tackled it from the Indian perspective. Oh yes, there have been dozens of books written about Afghanistan, by Americans, by Westerners. There have been books written in Russian language. There have been a couple of books in Pakistan as well, but I don't think there has been one looking at it from a purely Indian perspective. And it was, in that sense, something which is worth looking at, because I think one very clear lesson from the period of 1996 till 2001, when India did not have a presence in Afghanistan, that was the Taliban period. Otherwise, Afghanistan was one of the first countries with whom we established diplomatic relations when India became independent. We signed a peace and friendship agreement with them, in a sense a precursor to what was the strategic partnership. Those days, the terminology that we used was not strategic partnership agreements. Those days, in the 50s and 60s, the terminology that was used were peace and friendship agreements. And like we signed the peace and friendship treaty with Nepal, with Bhutan, we are talking of 49, 50. That's around the time we also signed the peace and friendship treaty with Afghanistan. And had close relations. And as I said, the only period when we did not have contact was the period of the Taliban, 96 till 2001. And when we went back in 2001, and I think it has been a consistent article of faith since then, as part of the thinking of, irrespective of whichever government has been in power, that this time, there will never be a time when we will ever be faced with that kind of a situation, that our presence in Afghanistan is something which is important. And here, Avinash has given you an idea into the structure. And it's an interesting structure to look at. But I think, as he explained to you, the idea of what he describes as partisans and conciliators. Now, here, I sometimes think that perhaps as a researcher, and I guess this is always a challenge, because what you want to do is you take a set of events, and then what you try and do is you get a framework or a structure, and then you try and fit those into that kind of a structure. That's obviously the job of a researcher. He does it admirably. In doing that, you tend to develop or bring out different kinds of nuances. You try to expose a new, you try and sort of shine a light on a hitherto unexplored aspect of the relationship. But then the fact is that, like what he says, conciliators and partisans, I would say that perhaps in many occasions, what happens is that whether you are a conciliator or whether you are a partisan, I mean, it also depends upon the role of the political leadership in Delhi at that time. I mean, the government in Delhi wants to take a certain line. A person who Avinash would describe as a conciliator may be acting a role as a partisan, because the government adopts a certain policy. And I think here you define three drivers. You've talked of three drivers. Again, I would have a slightly different nuance, but anyway, I mean, Avinash has talked of three drivers: the balancing between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the international, and which is the third one, is domestic Afghan politics. But there is a fourth. You may not call it a driver, but it is certainly a key determinant, and that is the stability of the government in Delhi and how engaged it would be. I mean, if you remember 79, it was a period, there was a vacuum kind of a thing. There was Charan Singh government, and then we were going to have elections and all the rest of it. So there was a bit of a lull. You'd had the Morarji government replaced by the Charan Singh government and so on. Then once again, if you look back at 89, 90, again, the Rajiv Gandhi government was out. You had a VP Singh government for a while, you had a Chandrasekhar government for just a few months and so on, and then you were going to have elections. So once again, in these periods of flux, I think you will find, therefore, some of the, gray areas that you see, perhaps arise because the government of that day in Delhi is more preoccupied with its own domestic environment, political environment, and therefore less likely to take a more active interest and would rather prefer to shelve the problem, as it were. And I think that also becomes a key determinant of policy, particularly in something like this. The other thing I would say, this is not a criticism, because any researcher, any academic will obviously like to as I said, develop a new construct. I mean, that is the creativity part of, that is the analytic creativity part of the academic. But then let's remember, I mean, in a situation like this, no theoretical framework will actually survive contact with the Afghan reality for more than, a few weeks or a few months. That is because the involvement of the major powers in the world, in Afghanistan, is something which is critical. So therefore, it also brings in a different set of issues. Now, India-Afghanistan equation is an extremely important equation for us, but then it can't be handled without taking into account the India-US equation, which is also a hugely important equation for us, or the India-Russia equation, which is also hugely important for us. And India is not really a player that can manage, say, the US-Russia relationship. I mean, we are not the ones, if we find that today Russia and the US have differences between each other on Afghanistan, then I'm afraid India is really, we need to be realistic about it. India is not the one that can help US and Russia bridge that gap, because the US-Russia relationship or their differences on Afghanistan are a reflection of so many other strategic compulsions that for us to think that we are therefore the center of the universe and can therefore manipulate it would also be incorrect. So once again, while this theoretical construct has its own advantage in terms of highlighting some of the dilemmas of the Indian policy making, but there is an element of over-centralization, because you may end up going through the book, you may end up going away with the impression that India was playing that much of a central role. No, actually we weren't, for the simple reason that there were all the other major powers of the world who were much more actively involved with boots on the ground and things like that, and therefore our relationship with those major powers also played a key role in the backdrop of formulating whichever policies we did. But nonetheless, it's also, what is remarkable about, as I said, is that not just that it deals with, it's an India-centric, and I've tried to balance it by saying the downside of just looking at it as India-centric. But then, there are many other books, and I guess you wanted to do it from an India-centric perspective. But at the same time, there is also a wealth of detail, because it is highly well-documented, well-researched, well-cited. The extent of the number of interviews and first-hand accounts that Avinash has been able to have access to is quite remarkable. one thing I would just say, where you talk about the Indian Economic Cooperation Program and, the fact that it has been, I think, a remarkable success story. I think it is important to perhaps to mention here that compared to the others, when India, let's say, when India has today committed up to $3 billion, we've already spent nearly $2.5 billion. But I think it is important for, in a community like this, to understand, and I hope that in the revised edition, or whenever you come out with your next edition, you will just add a little para on something like this, which is that normally in the international donor community, so to say, there is a pledge, there is a commitment, and then there is actual delivery. By the time you get from pledge to delivery, and especially in a place like Afghanistan where it would be difficult to implement projects because of the remoteness, because of security-related concerns, etc., the average pledge to delivery ratio goes down to about 1/4 in case of the World Bank and UN related. In other words, what I'm saying is that the pledge may have been by USAID or the World Bank or something like that for $100. By the time the pledge gets converted into a commitment, namely for a specific project, so the pledge is for assistance, then somebody decides, okay, we want to spend it on, say, building schools or building hospitals or primary healthcare centers. So by the time the advisors come in and they do their reports and things like that, and it gets converted into a commitment, and then from that commitment, it actually starts getting converted into delivery with its oversight, monitoring, etc., you will find that you're only left with $25 with which to actually construct the school. In India's case, when we've pledged $2.5 billion, we've committed $2.5 billion and delivered $2.5 billion. In other words, all our administrative overheads have been borne by us directly and not out of what we have committed. And I think this is one of the key differences between the Indian assistance program and any other assistance program which the other major donor countries have undertaken, both in Afghanistan or elsewhere. One point of criticism that I will have before I close is that I think that somewhere there is also, I think there are occasions where perhaps when we are looking at so many different players spread over such a long period of time, there are occasions where I feel that there has been a bit of a overstretch, as it were, in terms of not being very categorical with dates, or there is a compression of dates. I mean, on page 254, for example, you've talked of, on page 253, you talk of when the Iraq war began, which is in early 2003, and you're talking of concerns that India had about the fact that Iraq was going to be a very expensive distraction from Afghanistan, which it was. But then, somewhere on page 254, you talk about Mukhopadhyay, who was in Kabul as a liaison officer at that time and participated in many closed-door meetings and argued that India's interest was Afghanistan than Iraq. But Mukho had left in 2002. In 2002, Ambassador Karju had already taken over. I mean, you've continued to say that top Indian military generals as well as Narayanan were of a similar view. Yes, they were. But then Narayanan only became National Security Advisor in January of 2005. So, I mean, since one has been part of it, so therefore one knows all those dates. But if somebody else were to just read this paragraph, the way it comes together is as if Mukhopadhyay and Narayanan were there at the same time, which they weren't, because this debate was taking place in 2003. And neither Mukhopadhyay nor Narayanan were at that time part of it. Yes, they may have had similar views. I mean, I'm not disputing that. But so there are a couple of places which I think ought to do this little bit of a cleaning up. As Avinash said, we all, in end August, we had President Trump with his new South Asia speech, which has been analyzed threadbare by all our strategic experts and commentators. And now we have, but then after that, we had the release of those American-Canadian hostages, the couple with their 3 children. And suddenly you had a tweet from President Trump, which completely changed everything. And now you have another speech just before Tillerson comes here at the CSIS in Washington, which has once again created a different kind of a buzz. And I think here we need to understand that speeches very often reflect long-term thinking and policy because they are written down and so on. But in today's age of diplomacy with tweets, very often it is the tactical which ends up overtaking the becoming more important. And that's where some of the risks are. But nonetheless, my congratulations to you. And I'm sure many of our audience here will enjoy reading the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Rakesh. I think you've really gone over it in great detail. My next speaker is Vishal Chandra. Vishal's book is Those Called the Unfinished War in Afghanistan, 2001-2014. It's primarily domestic, and rightly so, because the two obviously cannot be linked. So Vishal, over to you.
Thank you, sir, for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to share my views, my own perception about Dr. Avinash Palewal's book. What I'm going to do is I'm going to confine myself to those chapters which deal with pre-2001, India's involvement in Afghanistan, the complex decision-making process, because Ambassador Sood has already reflected in detail regarding our policy approach towards Afghanistan post-2001. My initial impression, I've given one quick read to the book. My initial impression is that it's a must-read book to begin with. I think it is a major value addition to the existing body of literature, something that Ambassador Sood has also pointed out, because I haven't come across any such book, at least from this part of the world, dealing with India's policy approaches, the various contradictions that were there, the dilemmas that the Indian policy makers were facing back in the 80s and 90s, particularly starting with the overthrow of King Zahir Shah in 73. So I think that generations of scholars are going to benefit. They are going to find your book as a credible source of information, a key reference literature. Author has exhausted almost all available resources, almost all available sources of information. He has conducted field visits. He has interviewed a cross-section of policymakers, not only in India, but in United States and United Kingdom. He has consulted a wide range of sources, archival sources, apart from conducting interviews. Something that is reflected throughout his book. There are several anecdotes provided in his book that gives us that is something very informative. That is precisely why I regard his book as a major reference book. And in many ways, his book is the one of its kind, because not only in terms of the long period it covers, but the way he has structured it. Of course, one can question your categorization of the strategic thought process in India into two, as conciliators and as partisans. But that somewhere shows your penchant, your structured thinking, which is very critical when you're approaching a topic as complex as Afghanistan, and particularly when you are dealing with with a long period, starting with the Soviet intervention, Soviet invasion, to the pullout of troops by United States in 2014. So the sheer range of events, it's something which is very admirable about this book, and you have made it very reader-friendly in the sense the text simply flows, from the first chapter, starting from epilogue. that epilogue is very interesting because it brings out several contradictions, and it's easy to connect what happened post-2001 with pre-2001. There's several parallels as far as various processes concerning reconciliation in Afghanistan is concerned, the role of the regional countries. And your book very interestingly brings out several obscure facts, lesser known facts in great detail starting with 1973. And your book unfolds a broad canvas. It presents readers with a very broad canvas. You're not only looking at India, Afghanistan, or providing an overview of Russian involvement or Iranian things that are well known. You have gone beyond and you have analyzed the very basis of their response, the reasons why they have, you have tried to explain their behavior, the Russian behavior, the Iranian behavior. So to that extent, your book, I think, is a must read, and I'm sure it will be a major reference work for the next generation of scholars. There was a very interesting statement somewhere in the book, I'm forgetting exactly the page number, where you have talked about Rao's, former Prime Minister Rao's doctrine, and you have listed out, I think almost 5 points. Now, that has a very close resemblance, not all, but at least 3 points I remember correctly. Remember how they have very close resemblance with our policy approaches as of now. I think the statement that was made by our permanent representative to the UN in 2002, and I'm quoting him because I think this is the crux, as we say in Hindi, the nichod or the sar of the policy dilemmas that we went through in 80s and 90s, particularly when Afghanistan was a stateless state in the 90s. And I'm quoting him because this, in my view, remains the cornerstone of our engagement strategy in Afghanistan. He says, it is important to listen carefully to what the Afghans need and respect their priorities and preferences, as no one knows better than the Afghans what is good for them and how best to do it. And then he cautions the international community against the temptation to foist solutions or structures not suitable or responsible to the local environment, since it will neither serve the causes of the donors nor of the Afghans. And he further argues that in determining what will work, sustainability should be the touchstone. I think that remains the basis of our engagement, and that also explains why Afghans would often tell us that we are a very reluctant partner. Well, there are reasons, and if one goes through the first 2 chapters, it comes out very clearly why we have been reluctant when it comes to providing certain kind of assistance that Afghanistan had been asking for. As far as Pakistan's policy is concerned, again, there are several parallels. In fact, when I went through the first 2 chapters, I was reminded of what Pervez Musharraf had said back in 2006 when he was visiting London. He gave an interview to BBC Radio 4. He said, "You will be brought down to your knees if Pakistan doesn't cooperate with you. That is all that I would like to say. Pakistan is the main ally. If we were not with you, you won't manage anything." Now, if you look at Pakistani responses post-Trump strategy, what are they trying to do? They're keeping the rhetoric high, but at the same time, they are trying to redefine their ties with the United States. They're looking for a very different framework, though the mechanisms are old. I think the objective is to first tone down the American rhetoric, something they had done before as well. Secondly, to dilute the American agenda. And third, to retrieve or to restore the centrality of Pakistan in United States Afghan agenda. That's precisely what they are trying to do. President Ghani, well, I was going through some of the interesting quotations that you have provided in the first 2-3 chapters. I think Afghanistan, the leadership in Afghanistan, the challenge remains the same. It's Pakistan. And which was very well reflected, which very well echoed in what President Ghani said in May 2017 during the Kabul Process Conference, where he said, our problem, our challenge is that we cannot figure out what is it that Pakistan wants? What will it take to convince Pakistan that a stable Afghanistan helps them and helps our region? And he says, I went out on a limb to offer an olive branch to Pakistan. It has not been taken. It is not likely to be taken. So obviously some of the challenges remain, and one, they're going to, they'll continue to pose threat to Afghanistan. As far as India's involvement is concerned, well, I think Western countries, most of our regional neighbors, even sections of analysts in Afghanistan, they continue to look at India's engagement post-2001 through the Pakistani constructs, to an extent even within India. Similarly, Pakistan, it continues to look at India's engagement through its own, through the constructs that they have built post-47, whereby India is not supposed to have any presence to its west. Now, that, in my view, that remains a constraining factor, and that's something we have to live with. But looking at the current situation in Afghanistan, I think the key question is, that's one question that comes to my mind after going through your book. Can Afghanistan afford to wait for Pakistan to evolve into a benign neighbor, a progressive, development-oriented, or can India afford to wait for Pakistan to evolve or emerge as a benign neighbor? I think, so what are the options before Afghanistan or India? I think Afghanistan, where the leadership has failed, in my personal view, is they have a constitution which is extremely progressive, and it connects Afghanistan to its first decade of democracy, that is 1960s. This constitution is very much grounded in the contemporary realities of Afghanistan. It acknowledges the social and the political diversity of the country. Afghanistan cannot go back to 70s or 80s. They have experimented with various political ideologies, systems. I think the current system is the most broad-based that Afghanistan ever had. So sustenance of this political system and constitution is important. And the biggest threat that Afghanistan faces is from this whole idea of an Islamic emirate. Now, protecting Islamic Republic is something which is again very critical. It is critical to India's own role and position in Afghanistan. So we do not really have too many options. In my view, though you have referred to policy flux in the epilogue, but, well, it was relevant maybe in the 80s, but I think most of the time we never really had too many options. Afghanistan often doesn't leave us with too many options. Secondly, it's a war of ideas and ideologies, something which we need to factor in when we are assessing India's involvement. I think somewhere India's role in terms of broadening this space for Afghans to build their institutions, to build their capacities, has not been appreciated. It remains underappreciated, and it's likely to remain so, because again countries continue to look at India's involvement through the old constructs. But Afghanistan somewhere, I think, needs to go beyond, because diplomacy will take its own course, politics will take its own course, strategic partnerships will take their own course. But Afghanistan needs to strengthen the idea of Afghanistan as enshrined in the constitution, because that, to me, that is the only way forward. They have experimented with various ideologies and political systems. So this is the one which is inclusive, which takes into account the contemporary ground realities, the social realities of the country. So somewhere they need to strengthen the idea of Afghanistan, and that is where Afghan leadership, and I'm not talking of the political leadership alone. In general, even the civil society there has failed to strengthen. There is no consensus. Secondly, Pakistan's support for Haqqani Taliban network or various other groups is a major ideological challenge, and I don't see any counter narrative emerging from within the region. There is a basis. Of course, the constitution is there. Attempts are on to build some kind of a regional consensus, very clearly evident in the outcome of the Amritsar Declaration, the BRICS Declaration, recent BRICS Declaration, but that remains fragmented at the moment. And I don't see any collective region-wide effort to counter militant extremism in the region. So I think it is critical for Afghanistan, for the political system in Afghanistan, to build a counter narrative. And that is not possible unless and until the idea of Afghanistan is strengthened or is defined by the political and the social leadership of the country. Well, I'd like to conclude here, and all the best. And I must compliment you for your book, and to the public, compliment the publisher as well, HarperCollins. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Vishal. Writing contemporary history. Mukho, please come up. You've been cited, but you were not here then. Please come up. Writing contemporary history is necessary, but very problematic. Particularly in a situation like India, when we do not release official records, official files. So one has to rely on newspapers, reminiscences, discussions, which are very useful, but obviously will not always stand up to the scrutiny of what a historian wants. So which is why I think it's a very, very brave effort and a tremendously comprehensive effort. By and large, I'm in quite agreement with the book, which is not always the case when I read about Afghanistan. So I must compliment. Of course, there are issues which others have also pointed out of categorization, which I think in Western academia is necessary. But when I see Rakesh as a conciliator and Vivek as a partisan, prima facie looks okay, but I know at different moments, and Rakesh and I both remember Lahore in 1999, I cannot think of a person at that stage more conciliator than Vivek could be. So, sometimes it does become, categorizations do lead to problems. Having said that, what really I see from the book is that, yes, we do not see Afghanistan through the eyes of Pakistan, and therefore that's a very good thing. But that at different times in our history post-71, when India did get an opportunity to at least embarrass Pakistan or further than that, we did not. Forbearance was our opted policy for which was exercised. And this was not just in terms of fishing in troubled water, but even going forward and discussing how you could protect your interests better, or specifically how you could strengthen Afghanistan better at those moments of time. But Indian policymakers felt that a stable, and we actually believed our own rhetoric, that a stable Pakistan is in India's interest. And in that sense, I think we could have done more at different times in Afghanistan, which we did not do. Now, Avinash is very puzzled about this Taliban syndrome and why we could adjust to the Mujahideen in 92, but not. Though he quotes Pranab Nanda, 97 article saying that India was opening up to Taliban. That I think is a rare article because by and large the attitude was quite different, and I think in agreement with it. The Mujahideen, other than say the seven Tanzeems, other than the Hizb-e-Islami, Hikmatyar, others had various problems with the Pakistani authorities even when they were operating out of Peshawar, because all money and all assistance to them flowed through the ISI only. So there was that feeling of the goodwill which ISI could have developed with the Tanzeem did not happen. That was a very different situation where the Taliban was. So that does explain, and the world had also changed. In the 90s, as an example, when people mentioned that Taliban brought stability and peace to Afghanistan, it was badly run. Whether you like Ismail Khan or not, Herat at that moment was a fairly peaceful and a prosperous place that the Taliban walked in. It was not that they were walking into chaos everywhere, So Taliban does have problematic, which of course subsequently, as we have seen. As I said, I don't want to talk too much because we rather want to open it up. But there are various issues that, and especially the reason India is very popular in Afghanistan among others, one of course is that it is seen as a success story, that India does not pick favorites, India does not play games. In the 80s, and there were tensions within India, which we told the Russians also, which the book has brought out very admirably, Technically, we were supporting the legal government of Afghanistan. We did that in the period from 1994 to 2001 also. We did have diplomatic relations with Afghanistan. We did not have to the Taliban, fine, but we did recognize a legitimate Islamic government of Afghanistan in that period. And we do not get into, and therefore, the Karzai period you mentioned that India swung behind Karzai, because Karzai was a legitimate president of Afghanistan, full stop. It was not for India to decide whether it should be Karzai as the president, or Mr. X, or Mr. Y, not the X that you talk about all the time, any other X. He has a source called X throughout the book. So not that X, of course, but it is not for India to decide. It's definitely not for India. We shall work every time with whoever is in power. That was the clear message that we do. Unless we see you, as we saw the Taliban, differently. And yes, the US factor is very important. The fact is that the USA has taken a long time, and people are still not convinced, into understanding that yes, while Pakistan has to be part of the solution, Pakistan is the cause of the problem also. And at certain moments, it seems to be a realization, but then they go back. And as Vishal just pointed out, Musharraf told them that you'll be down on your knees without me. But, Avinash, here I do have a bone to pick on page 256 when you're quoting a Ron Newman telegram saying that yes, Americans did realize that the Pakistanis were playing games. And then you quote a Ron Newman telegram which says actually something quite different. It says that while we've been doing all this, the Taliban has regrouped, reorganized and thought over in territory beyond the control of either government. In other words, Ron Newman is giving the Pakistanis a free check that they did not deserve. The Taliban resurgence would not have happened but for the fact that it was Pakistan behind it. Not just in safe havens, but every which way. I'll only close a little bit by talking about the Constitution. I disagree with Vishal on that. I think anybody who tries to copy the American Constitution is in for a disaster. Absolute disaster. It's a Constitution not meant to function. It cannot function. And and the Latin Americans have been discovering for a long time. But somehow it seems to be popular. And I have many other things, but I'm not going to, except that this one example which I have been quoting for 15 years, which I'm happy that Professor Tim did it in Herat the other day when some of us were present. Now, political parties are there in Afghanistan, but they cannot contest elections. There are no constituencies in the form that you and I know it, no elected districts. So let's take the province of Kabul as an example. Kabul sends 33 members to the lower house of parliament, the Volesi Jirga. 33. There are no constituencies, but there's no list system. So 680 candidates filed the nomination to become member of parliament from Kabul province. So you have a ballot book. It's not a ballot paper. 680 names is a ballot book. And everybody has one vote. And the first 33, I'm taking out the women's thing for the time because of argument, and the first 33 get elected. And they represent the whole province. So they don't represent a constituency. So the first person who got into Kabul, elected from Kabul, polled about 16 or 18,000 votes. And the last person who got MP, become a member of parliament from Kabul, polled 300 votes. You have no geographical constituency. 300 people have voted for you and a member of parliament. To me, among other things, it's the remedy for disaster. In terms of democratic accountability and identification of a voter with his agent, the member of parliament. In a representative form of democracy, not a direct form of democracy, the elected are my agents. Principal agent issue is always there, of course. But if I don't even know who my agent is, then it's not a very healthy for democracy. I have more to say, but I'll leave it at that. That's not key to the book. But because Vishal had raised it, I thought I'll just point it out. Except once again to congratulate Avinash on the book. The book has a couple of typos, which is nothing, which is minor, which I think copywriting will make it better. But I think it's a very good publication, and the quality of the publication is also very good. I must compliment the publishers for that. So there are no obvious glaring things in it. It looks very neat and clean, And as I said, it's very well researched. Even if you don't agree with all of it, I think the wealth of information it brings to the table, the wealth of it is sheer. I mean, I can't even imagine. In recent memory, I've not seen a book on Afghanistan, especially on India and Afghanistan, in any aspect that brings it out in such a richness. So with that, let me now end, and we'll open it up for Q&A.